ready to go.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sharon Gerstal, Associate Director of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, and I welcome you to what promises to be a fascinating lecture. Therese Martin is one of our distinguished visiting scholars this year, which means that she comes and gives a public lecture and then also teaches in the classroom, which is an opportunity for us to learn from world-renowned scholars, both the general public, our students, the faculty who enjoy their company when they're on campus. And I can think of no greater delight than the topic and the scholar who is here this evening, a scholar whose work I've known and admired for so many, can I say decades? So many years, let me put it that way politely. Anyway, I'm thrilled to have this lecture tonight, and I would ask her sponsor, Professor Meredith Cohen, from the Department of Art History, to give the formal introduction. But thank you for being here this evening. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. It's ninth week. I know people are very busy, and it's good to see so many of you here. I am really thrilled to welcome Professor Therese Martin to the CMRS as Distinguished Visiting Professor tonight. She is a scholar of medieval Spain, particularly its art and architecture, and the strong women who commissioned it. She received her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh and has been so fortunate since 2009, has been a tenured researcher at the Spanish National Research Council in Madrid, so where she lives, following 9 years at the University of Arizona. So she's fortunate, and she comes to us all the way from Madrid. Currently, she's Crater Visiting Professor of History at Stanford University, with a fellowship also from the Spanish Ministry of Education. She's held numerous awards, to name a few: Fulbright, Mellon, de Montequin, Cress, and Getty Fellowships, in support of her research on women's involvement with art and architecture, on Romanesque sculpture, and elite patronage. I got to know her work as a kind of prelude and counterpart, a beautiful counterpart to work that I had been doing in France, and she is doing sort of similar and work on an earlier subject in Spain, and is the author of a brilliant and prize-winning book, Queen as King, Politics and Architectural Propaganda in 12th Century Spain. She's also been the editor of a book titled Reassessing the Role of Women as Makers of Medieval Art and Architecture, which came out in paperback also in 2015. So for these different projects, she's also received different, nationally renowned fellowships and funds from Spain. And tonight her talk is entitled, as you see here, At the Crossroads of Cultural Networks, the Creation of a Medieval Treasury at San Isidoro de León. I'm really excited to hear this talk. Please join me in welcoming Therese Martin.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to Meredith for inviting me to UCLA, and to the CMRS for sponsoring my visit, and to Sasha Wadman and the rest of the administrative staff for such efficient organization. It is a true pleasure to be here with you all. I'm also grateful to Spain's Ministries of Economy and Education for funding my research project, to San Isidoro and to the Museo Arqueológico Nacional for giving me access to their collections, and to Stanford's History Department for hosting me as a visiting scholar until next March. Today I'd like to give you a sense of the scope of my current research project, the medieval treasury across frontiers and generations, the Kingdom of León Castilla in the context of Muslim-Christian interchange, circa 1050 to 1200. In the photo, you see some of the members of my team during different on-site campaigns, along with other scholars like Jeremy Johns and Ana Cabrera, who have joined up with me as they pursue their own research projects on rock crystal and medieval silks, respectively. We will take a rather whirlwind look at the project overall, going into real depth only on the so-called Beatitudes Casket, which you see in the center here. At the heart of my project is the rich collection of luxury goods in the Treasury of San Isidoro de León, of which I show just a small part here, all still in situ, from, for example, a Fatimid silver casket from the mid-11th century, a purple silk textile, possibly Byzantine, the reliquary that presumably the bones of San Isidoro were kept in, a very small silver niello and gilt, as with this, caskets or containers from Al-Andalus, a very odd, not niello, but silver gilt casket that we have no idea how to date. The two Roman cups that were put end to end in the 11th century and given as a gift, and a 12th century ivory. And this is just to give you a sense of the large scope of the project overall. For this group of objects, I use the word collection consciously if cautiously. My working hypothesis is that this is not primarily a random accumulation over time, but instead that many of the pieces reflect a mind at work, deliberately bringing together objects from far-flung lands. For its remarkable range of high-quality pieces to its various written sources, San Isidoro's Treasury functions within my project as a jumping-off point to examine larger questions about networks of contact within and beyond Iberia during the Central Middle Ages, identifying women as vectors of culture and emphasizing the geographically charged nature of objects. In general terms, the creation of a medieval treasury offers a material witness that reveals the interests and aspirations of those who established it. As is well known, luxury objects with great intrinsic value became even more prized by Christian owners if the piece were turned to a sacred use. Beyond pious donations to a favored foundation, treasuries could function as a source of gifts for allies, which bound them with reciprocal obligations, or as prestigious possessions for the owner's ostentation before an elite audience. Chronicles, charters, and hagiographies recount the changing circumstances of golden caskets, precious gems, and silk textiles, making clear not only the great importance of material culture for elite self-presentation, but also for the economy of the powerful. At San Isidoro de León, we see clearly the geographic resonance in objects that originated in distant lands, along with the key roles played by women in the development of this treasury. The backstory to this collection begins in 1063, when the relics of Saint Isidore of Seville were translated to León. They were deposited with great pomp in a ceremony of reconsecration at the royal monastic church dedicated to Saint John the Baptist, which had been built around 1055 in the kingdom's capital city by the ruling couple, Fernando I of León Castilla, reigned 1037 to 1065, and his consort Sancha, died 1067. In this image, the 11th century church is not visible in elevation, but one wall still stands, and its complete foundations are known, marked in red at the center of the ground plan. San Juan Bautista was the male half of a mixed community, where female religious were under the advocation of the early 10th century Iberian martyr Pelayo. An account contemporary with Isidore's translation provides the basic information about his installation in León. A second source, purporting to date from the same moment and detailing a grand donation of luxury goods and extensive lands, tells us that 1063 was also the occasion for the rich endowment of the church by Fernando and Sancha. In this source, the remarkable list of objects includes gold and silver altar frontals embellished with emeralds and sapphires, golden votive crowns, crosses of gold and ivory, boxes of ivory worked in gold or silver, textiles of silk, gold, ermine, and much, much more. Until the now underway renovation of the museum space, objects from the treasury had been displayed in an upper chamber of the royal palace attached to the west end of the church. That's this area here, and the chalice of Urraca has been separated out just to be by itself in this space. What you see with this outline here is the 1055 church built by Fernando and Sancha, and its 12th century reconstruction by their daughter Urraca and their granddaughter, also named Urraca. The 1063 donation charter, much loved by art historians for its remarkably evocative character, has been used to associate the treasury at San Isidoro with a single moment in time, that is, the offering made by Fernando and Sancha. And this is especially true for the ivories, especially the Beatitudes Casket, which have been identified with a royally sponsored workshop established in León during Fernando's reign. However, the charter itself has long been recognized as problematic, and in 2007, the paleographer Encarnación Martín López demonstrated definitively that the 1063 donation had in fact been written in the 12th century in a hand imitating Visigothic script. It is not a forgery per se, according to Martín López. She discusses the document almost as though it were a mini cartulary, in which 3 or so possibly original charters have been merged together to create a maxi donation. The confection of this document is interpreted as a response to the need for a written guarantee of the rights and privileges of the monastery at a time undefined, perhaps around the middle of the 12th century. One goal, therefore, of my research is to home in on the social and political context which led to the creation of this document. Just who in the 12th century would have had a driving need to produce such a charter? Today I offer a possible answer, and I will be particularly interested in your critiques of my solution. As has been noted in passing by every scholar working on objects from San Isidoro's collection, the lone surviving piece that can be recognized from the 1063 donation is this crucifix. It is one of 6 objects belonging to San Isidoro that were requisitioned by the Government Commission in 1869 to become part of the new National Archaeological Museum in Madrid, an extraordinary number of pieces to have been appropriated from a single monument. In the 1063 donation, this object appears as, quote, another cross, this one of ivory, with a representation of our crucified Redeemer. And that's it. Not one survives of the gold bejeweled antipendia, golden crowns and crosses, caskets of crystal, thuribles, censers and incense boats, gold enameled chalice and paten set, candle holders, platters and ewers, not to mention the wealth of silks and gold worked liturgical textiles that are all listed in the 1063 donation. Even when the material might suggest a surviving object, the phrasing is too general to make definite identification possible, such as the case for, quote, an ivory box worked with gold, and 2 more of ivory worked with silver. Inside one of these are 3 small boxes made of the same material, and a diptych also of ivory. In fact, it was the insistent repetition of ivory that first made me pay close attention to this document, for it is very unusual to find more than 1 or 2 pieces of ivory listed in Spanish donations or inventories for the Central Middle Ages. And yet, as I noted at the beginning of my talk, San Isidoro boasts an extraordinary collection of objects from the Central Middle Ages, and indeed many are of ivory, though none that has come down to us today is worked with gold or silver. There are some 30 pieces from the 10th to 12th century still in situ, with another dozen works at major museums in Madrid, Paris, St. Petersburg, and New York, among others. And scholars have gone to great lengths in attempts to match more than just the crucifix with this donation. One of my objectives is to ask new questions of the 12th century charter, interrogating the goals behind its creation rather than making one more frustrated attempt to turn it into a checklist for existing objects. Within the project, my 11-member team and I are carrying out for the first time ever a range of technical analyses on various pieces from the Leonese treasury, including the Beatitudes Casket, my visual metaphor for the whole. Here, Mónica Ruiz, my colleague from the archaeology department at the CSIC in Madrid, is taking a sample of wood for carbon-14 testing, with help just behind her from Jerry Lynn Dodds, and under the watchful and slightly nervous eyes of 2 of the curators from the Museo Arqueológico in Madrid. The casket is fully covered by high-quality ivory plaques, whose unconventional figural imagery on 3 sides gave rise to the name by which it is known. It displays angels and undifferentiated personifications of the Beatitudes, identified by abbreviated inscriptions from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 3-12. On the leftmost plaque, for example, you can read in the inscribed arch, "Blessed are the peacemakers." This is where all of the inscriptions are. However, the plaque for the 4th side the plaques on the fourth side were clearly produced in Islamic lands, which has led to scholarly work to determine the place of each set of ivories within their separate histories. It has, of course, been recognized that the current configuration cannot be the original one, because some of the Beatitudes are missing, and also the plaques should be set into the wood, not nailed on top. Yet this casket is always associated with the 1063 donation, providing an apparently firm date for the style of the plaques with Christian imagery. But now that we know that the document must not be taken at face value, we can examine this object with fresh eyes. My sense is that stylistically, the movement of the figures, the play of the angel's wings across the enframing arches, and the relatively naturalistic drapery folds may indicate that we are looking at something rather closer to the end of the 11th century than the middle. I'll be glad to hear what others think of this impression. For an analysis of the uncommon iconography, I turned to the work of team member Julie Harris, who situates the making of these images within the context of the Hispanic liturgy, which was in the process of being replaced by the Roman Rite in the end of the 11th century and into the turn of the 12th. And for the Arabic inscriptions, I have sought help from Maria Antonia Martinez Núñez, epigrapher extraordinaire, who is currently working on deciphering the texts. I am most grateful for her collaboration and very pleased to be able to present her preliminary results here today. The first inscription, which belongs with the two centrally placed plaques, is the only one that had previously been read. It gives us the name Ismael, son of Al-Mamun, he of the two glories. Al-Mamun was the ruler of the Taifa kingdom of Toledo from 1043 to 1075. These three fragments can easily be located within the Cuenca ivory workshop around 1050 by comparison with other stylistically similar objects that bear dated inscriptions. But the other four fragments, apparently all from a single larger casket, are much more complicated to set within a specific context. In fact, these inscriptions have often been taken for pseudo-script rather than a highly ornamental but true Arabic. Now, thanks to Martinez Núñez's reading, we can begin to situate the plaques in a particular place and time. From this box, two long sides have been preserved, and both were reused upside down in order to take advantage of the vegetal border as a framing device within the new setting. You can see that here and there. It is a particularly ornate kufik with graphic features that are present in some Andalusi inscriptions from the 11th century. Martinez Núñez has been able to recognize the following parts of phrases. In the upper plaque, labeled 2, with glory was. Below 3, joy and blessing as two separate words. In 4, the smallest fragment, happiness. And finally, 5, on what would have been the box's lid, for its owner, end of sentence, the gratitude. This wording is typical of the sorts of generic statements of good wishes for an unspecified owner seen on luxury goods that were made on spec, still elite production for the costliness of the materials, but not made under official state control, as was the case with the late 10th and early 11th century Cordoban ivory group. Martinez Núñez argues that on the basis of its very ornamental type of script, we can be certain that this box is not from the well-known Cuenca workshop responsible for the other smaller plaques on the casket. Rather, the variety of kufik seen here is only comparable to the epigraphic lettering used by the Banu Dilmun of Toledo, who ruled 1032 to 1085, or by the Banu Hut of Zaragoza, 1039 to 1110. So, the dates for all the ivory pieces on this box would appear to coalesce around different moments in the latter part of the 11th century. When we carried out a carbon-14 analysis of the casket's wooden core, we therefore predicted one of two results. Either the wood was from the 11th century, like the ivories, or more likely from the 19th century when the object entered the Archaeological Museum in Madrid. Instead, we got back the wholly unexpected answer that the wood is firmly 14th century, with a 95% probability that it falls within the years 1295 to 1415. Two moments within this range stand out in the calibrated result, 1310 to 1360 and 1385 to 1405. This was not the answer I expected. Instead of focusing all my research on the Central Middle Ages, I now had to consider what the 14th century, a period far outside my comfort zone, had to offer in the context of this treasury. Again, to my surprise, documentary evidence from the archive at San Isidoro concords perfectly with the carbon-14 date, highlighting a significant moment in the institution's later medieval history. It was in 1331 that an itemization was undertaken of all of the relics and indulgences possessed by the monastery. This same charter also formalized the benefits of becoming a contributing member of San Isidoro's confraternity. The opening line directs the document's quote, "To all the faithful of God, whether clerics or knights, and good men and good ladies of whatever places this letter might be seen." The list of major relics, naturally, begins with Isidore himself, and it includes a 10-line summation of the many cures and other miracles wrought by the saint after his relics were translated from Seville to León. Isidore is followed in importance by Vincent, with his sisters Cristeta and Sabina. These 4 holy figures are highlighted because, as stated, their full bodies rest here, whereas the others are only noted briefly as relics from, bones of, dress of, and so on. The scribe ends his impressive list of Christological relics and martyrs' remains with the catch-all phrase, quote, "And there is still more, other bodies of saints that are not recounted here." Essential as this document has been in establishing historical context, from an art historical perspective, it is sadly wanting. For the canons at San Isidoro were not interested in inventorying the containers holding all their treasured relics. We're told only that, quote, "Among the other things, there are also 8 small caskets filled with relics and with saintly bodies, which, as we learned from our ancestors, they never dared to open." Following the scribe's detailing of the multiplicity of relics comes his request. Because of the church's great antiquity, it is in danger, and the canons can't undertake the major renovations needed without the help of good men and good women. They therefore, quote, "looked into the coffer of the treasury and found the indulgences and the pardons that the holy apostolic fathers in Rome and cardinals and archbishops and bishops gave and bestowed on those who did well for the monastery. That is, Pope Innocent, 1 year and 100 days of pardon, and then an extensive etc. of the indulgences granted by many ecclesiastical authorities." After noting the length of time of each indulgence, our scribe tots it all up. 500 years from the popes and 540-day periods from the archbishops and bishops. Quote, "And so we order that all those men and those women who join this confraternity and give an amount for construction work or for a laborer, we will receive them as siblings in the said holy confraternity and in the said pardons." End quote. Explaining in detail the prayers, vigils, and sacrifices, songs, processions, and ringing of bells that would be done on the donor's behalf, especially if they were to leave their best clothes to the monastery upon their deaths. This 1331 inventory was repeated in the last decade of the 14th century, stating that it was done in the presence of 2 royal notaries. There are some minor differences in the 2 texts, but on the whole, it is the same series of indulgences and relics. And yet, curiously missing from both lineups are the remains of Pelayo, one of the site's 2 original patrons, together with John the Baptist, before the arrival of Isidore. So it seems clear that the Beatitudes Casket was most likely put together in the 14th century when the canons took stock of their saintly treasure. They made new use of 3 old boxes whose broken fragments of precious ivory had been carefully stored away, creating a piece based on a common material rather than on a coherent iconography for the public display of some of their lesser relics. There is yet one final reason why this object represents for me the project as a whole. As unexpectedly easy as it was to find documentary evidence that dovetails with the technical analysis, the Beatitudes Casket has not yet given up all its secrets. We have made 3 attempts to open it. None has been successful. And it is not clear that the museum will be willing to try any additional methods. So we can't yet see inside it. Might there be a textile like those in other caskets from San Isidoro? Or will it have been stripped bare before being sent to Madrid in 1869? In the time I have left, I'd like to show you in a more freehand way some of the other objects that we're looking at, but not nearly in the same depth as I talked about the Beatitudes Casket. This is perhaps the most well-known of any of the objects at San Isidoro, a very large silver gilt reliquary, presumably always to have held the bones of Saint Isidore, but the iconography does not indicate that. It's Genesis scenes. And I'm showing you two photos from 1993 from the exhibition that didn't happen at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The catalog exists, but there were problems between the institutions in Spain and the Met with sort of who gets to be the boss, really, I think is what it came down to. So the exhibition was canceled just before it was to open. In any case, we've got gorgeous photos from that moment, and I want to contrast that with the state of the object as it is today, where you can see it's rather tarnished. As part of building the new museum that they're doing at the moment, presumably there will be cleaning and conservation, but I'm not sure of that. So inside this is one of those textiles that I talked about in thinking about the Beatitudes Casket. We have done carbon testing on this one. We've also begun the dyes analysis, but the carbon testing was much more expensive, so they got the results back to us quickly, whereas the dyes analysis are taking their time. We got a fairly nice 9th century date for this piece, which was not really a big surprise because it is not so different from other silks that are known from the area to the east of Byzantium. So it's not from China, but it's not as far west as Byzantium either, which the experts simply call Central Asia with a query. You can see some of our close details to appreciate the very fine quality of the silk, the very fine working of this piece. Presumably, this was the lowest level of textiles, and there were others that were put on top of it that have been stripped off when it moved into the museum. Inside the lid is a completely different type of piece, and this is one of the ones that I have been the most interested in trying to find out about. Because it's an embroidery. It's not a weaving like all of the rest of the textiles. Embroidery as a technique is much more fragile than a weaving, and because it doesn't have to be done in a workshop, because it's not repeated on a loom, it's a more freehand sort of thing. So we have nothing to compare this to, nothing at all. There are just a few embroidered textiles from Spain. There are quite a few more from Anglo-Saxon England, but I've sent images of this to a great expert there, and she said, it's definitely not Anglo-Saxon. We've got nothing like it here either. So this is something where I'm hoping that when we get the dyes analysis back, we really will be able to say something about it for the first time, as we now can about dating. It's solidly in the 10th century. That was unexpected as well. It's generally been called 11th century because it ended up in an 11th century reliquary. But what we know from some of the documents at the Cathedral of León is that old textiles were purchased and restored and repaired. The Bishop of León tells us that he spent more repairing his most precious old textiles than he did on purchasing new ones. And this is also from an 11th century document. So to own a 10th century piece of this is silk embroidered on linen. To own a piece of textile like this is something that you would take very good care of. And when it was placed in this lid, this is a problem. It may not have been done until the early 20th century restoration. It could have been part of what was wrapping the relics in the body as well. The closest stylistic comparison that I've been able to find is this one little double-sided ivory plaque from Silves in present-day Portugal, but in an Islamic settlement. I mean, it's not exact, but I've been looking at this for years, and I cannot find anything that's closer. We have a large number of textiles, especially weavings, where the animals are set in roundels. But to set them in squares is somehow quite different. Also, as you can see when you look at the whole, each of the animal's bodies is filled with a metallic thread. Now, calling it a metallic thread is something that I've been taught by the textile experts in my group, because I look at it and I see gold. And they say, you don't know it's gold until the material has been tested. You have to simply call it metallic. Well, our material was tested and it's gold. So that was fun, but it's actually not the best answer, because pure gold gives no indication of where it's from. Whereas if you have an alloy, then you can test that and make comparisons. So it tells us that it's the highest level of patronage. It tells us that it's for a very wealthy owner, donor, we don't know who, but we don't know where it's from. But as I say, hopefully once we get back the DIES results, we will know that. The animals are fairly typical of Islamic imagery as well. So we've got peacocks, eagles, gazelles, one partial sort of halfway between a dragon and a phoenix, but I don't have a good photo of him. But what I wanted to show you up close also in this detail is how little of the gold really is left, and yet it still is quite brilliant. If all of these threads were wrapped in gold as they were originally, all of these filling in the body and the head, it would be magnificent. In the 1070s, the Infanta Baraka, sister of King Alfonso VI, gave him, I'm not sure if that noise is coming from here or outside. Outside, okay, shall I speak louder? The sister of the king gave him a gold tunic that she says that she purchased, a gold woven tunic that she says that she purchased for 2,000 pieces of gold. Now, whether something like this is one scrap that's left of that tunic, or if we're thinking about a woven tunic, not an embroidered piece, that I can't say. But it does give you a sense of the value of what you would wear to show off, to show your power. I'm going to hop quickly through several pieces in order to bring you as many as I can in this short time. We have two little heart-shaped silver gilt containers, and one of them has a later inscription that says, "These are the relics of Saint Pelayo," which makes that 1331 inventory even more curious. The list of saints and of scraps goes on and on and on, and yet they're ignoring San Pelayo, who's one of their original patron saints of the site. At this point, they only have a bit of him left that fits into this piece, because most have been taken up to Oviedo, but still, if it's still here today, it was there in 1331. So I don't know what to say about that. The one of them is still closed. The two little pins that lock it are kind of stuck, and I was not allowed to pull any harder than, trying to wiggle with my fingernail. Couldn't get it open. This is how small they are. These are precious little boxes to be given as a gift, and that's this ring. I used it for all of my photos of small things so I could show proportion, to really give you a sense of the precious nature of this type of tiny little box. Perhaps it would have been given in this type of box, because this is a sort of gift that you give something precious and you open it up, and there's something more precious inside, and then you open that, and the real gift is in the very middle. Now, this is a much earlier box. This is from the 10th century. But actually, we don't know the date of those little heart-shaped boxes. They're called about 1000. That has to do with typical leaf forms and the use of silver niello. But really, we don't know the date at all. And I have not done any metals testing as of yet. There is a curious parallel to our little heart-shaped box at San Isidoro, and that is one in Sardinia at a church which was said to have been founded by an Aragonese princess. Either she's escaping from her father, who wants to kill her because she's taken a lover and he doesn't approve, or she's going off to be married to someone and she's blown off course and lands in Sardinia. But in any case, the foundation of the church is from a Spanish princess. Curious that this box ends up there as well. It's more elaborate than the one at San Isidoro and has an inscription which reads, "Perpetual blessing and persistent favor and increasing bliss to its owner." Again, a sort of generic one, not made for any specific individual. But the frustrating aspect of this Sardinian box is that its date is given as about the year 1000, because the one in San Isidoro has been dated about the year 1000. So really we know nothing about either of them. And they're very different, as you can see. The general heart shape is the same, but the one in Sardinia is really much better. And particularly, it's better than this one, where the niello hasn't even been filled in. It looks like a kind of freehand. I mean, it's tiny, so you don't look that close, right? But the one in Sardinia is magnificent. So I'm hoping that Alex Metcalf, who sent these photos to me by way of Mariam Rosser Owen of the Victorian Albert, who is in my project, I'm hoping that he and his team working in Sardinia are going to give me some clues on their box that maybe I can apply to San Isidoro. At San Isidoro, well, we've got an extremely odd little Scandinavian box. And again, ring for scale. It's very small. When I sent photos of it to Nancy Wicker, who's an expert on this topic in Mississippi, the first thing she asked me is, "Why did you photograph it upside down?" And she's talking about these, not these. And I said, "Oh, I didn't know there was a right side up." And in every catalog that it's been published in, it's like this. When I talked to the conservators at San Isidoro, they said, well, because that's how it sits up most easily. It's simply about balance. So I'm hoping that when they do the new museum, they will figure out some way to get it right side up, because actually it's a bird face, and these are his wings coming back, but he's meant to be kind of lunging down from above. So this piece, which has only been dated by style, I'm working to encourage them to let me take a very tiny snip in order to do carbon testing as well. We shall see if that progresses. It's been said to be a reliquary because of the piercings, with the idea being that you can see through the holes. But actually, if you see, the holes are very tiny. And I suggested to Nancy Wicker that would it have been possible to think of this as a holder for perfumes, and that those tiny holes let the scents come out? And she said, yes, absolutely. And that I think the only reason it's been said to be a reliquary is that it ended up in a monastery. But that's not its purpose. Now, one of the major players, and a name that I have already said, is the Infanta Baraka. This is the sister of King Alfonso VI, the one who says she bought that tunic for 2,000 pieces of gold. She's a major player at San Isidoro, and she's, in the chronicles, they say things like, all of her life she followed her desire to adorn sacred altars and the vestments of the clergy with gold, silver, and precious stones. It was a kind of generic statement. There's not a specific reference, for example, to this chalice, which has her name on it right here, so there's really no doubting that it comes from her. As I mentioned at the beginning, these are two sardonyx Roman cups placed end to end, and then with this new filigree and inset gems around it. The inscription only says in the name of God, Urraca of Fernando, Urraca, Fernando's daughter. And I give it the date after 1067 with a query, because 1067 is when her mother died. It's when she, as the eldest child, became head of the inheritance known as the Infantazgo, which ruled over all the royal monasteries of the land. So she was, in fact, a great landowner, and never married, nor did she become a nun. Same with her great niece, the Infanta Sancha, that I will mention later on. So it's a kind of interesting role that they have at San Isidoro because they control wealth. Now this chalice is a thorn in my side at the moment, because if you read Spanish, you will know that it is the Holy Grail. And it's in León. In 2014, a woman who used to be a history professor and now is a politician published a little book in which she proved that this is the Holy Grail. And now they're making a movie about it. And, you know, that's the woman from Pulp Fiction who is playing this woman who is the scholar who said this. Because of this, this is the only object between the 10th and the 13th centuries that I have not been able to get my hands on. Because it's so precious to them now, even though they don't really believe it, but they want to believe. They want to because the Smithsonian has made a pseudo-documentary about it. I mean, it's just awful. And they're calling this film a fiction documentary. Yeah, all right. So let's move on to Quino Rocca. Because Quino Rocca, although I think the Infanta Baraka is a major player at San Isidoro, and we do have this chronicle reference, we've got charters about her, if I have to pick the person that I think needs to create the 12th century document, it's Quino Rocca. She inherits the throne from her father when he dies in 1126. She is the eldest child again, so as the tradition of naming goes, the eldest child in the generation before her, and then she takes it on. I'm showing you a very odd coin of hers, but it tells you something really important, both about her and her aspirations. It says, Urraca, king of all Hispania, and then on the other side, queen. All Hispania, the entire peninsula, she's claiming for herself. She's calling herself both king and queen. Now, of course, she never ruled the entire peninsula, but that's her ambition. That's her stated goal with this coin. And from what we know about her, no one is going to agree with me that she's the major patron. Because what especially the later chroniclers tell us is that she sacked churches and she stole sacred altar ornaments and she melted down the crosses that her aunt Elvira had given to a monastery. So how can I now say that she's created this treasury? Well, I think, first of all rulers sack churches. All rulers melt down coins. All rulers do this over and over again. But if you are a woman ruling in this period as a ruler in your own right, and after your first husband dies, you separate from your second husband and you take a favorite with whom you have at least 3 children before you die in childbirth with his 4th child at age 45, you get a bad reputation. This happened for the most part in the 13th century. And one of the people creating this reputation is Lucas of Tuy. He was a canon at San Isidoro in the early 13th century before becoming a bishop in Tuy. And he writes of her accepting the demon-like, the devilish advice of her not yet separated from second husband, that if she needs money to pay her soldiers, as he does, she should allow them to sack the church. So he does, she does. All right, we get that in Lucas of Tuy, fine. And everybody repeats that ever after. But what Lucas of Tuy also tells us that no one repeats, I'm going to tell you today. So this is from the Miracles of San Isidoro. It's not in a chronicle, it's in a hagiography. This is the one time that he says something nice about Urraca, and so that's why I believe him. What he says is, in order to expiate the aforementioned great crime, that is, of having allowed San Isidoro to be sacked, together with her most prudent daughter Sancha, who from childhood affirmed that she had taken San Isidoro as her spouse, refusing a husband's carnal coupling, with great zeal they desired to restore to the church of the Holy Confessor that which had been removed. In addition, the queen repeatedly proceeded to have many relics of saints zealously gathered from diverse parts of the world, and she had them placed with honor in caskets of silver and ivory. With royal munificence, she conferred many properties on the church, and during her lifetime, she had a burial place prepared for herself in the church with her forebears. Now, those last things are verifiable. She was buried in that church, and she did give a magnificent donation in 1117 of enormous properties. So if we can believe those two, can we also believe that she brought relics of saints from diverse parts of the world and had them laid in caskets of silver and ivory? I think we can, because Lucas also, when he talks about the other donations that Fernando and Sancha gave and that the Infanta Baraka gave, he talks about gold, because gold is the highest and the most important, and it's also kind of generic. But here we have very specifically caskets of silver and ivory. It's a hagiography, so right, we think we can never believe anything, but I believe this. Now, the legend that rises up around her from the end of the 13th century, that gets repeated down through the years, is that she herself sacked San Isidoro and the church killed her when she was leaving it with all of the treasures. So what you see is her laid out on the ground here with her head still in the doorway, there's her arm, and these are all the treasures around it because the church has taken its revenge upon her. That's how Quino Rocca is remembered. And yet, many of these pieces are from the 12th century. So whether we give them to Quino Rocca or not, we cannot give them to Fernando and Sancha. We have to think, who is doing this? And I think Quino Rocca, with that claim of calling herself the ruler of all Hispania, with having objects that come from many different places, and I have not mentioned, for example, she married her half-sister to Roger II of Sicily, and we have 3 Sicilian ivories here from the beginning of the 12th century. So, with this closing glimpse of some of the riches currently being explored by my group, I want to say that the material reality of ivories, textiles, and metalwork from San Isidoro are being studied together with written sources in charters, chronicles, and miracles, buttressed by technical analysis. I am especially interested in taking further the issue of interchange of luxury goods across frontiers, hoping to trace the ways by which Andalusi, Fatimid, Sicilian objects arrived in northern Iberia, not to mention the wealth of textiles from much farther east and the one tiny container from Scandinavian lands. Beyond trade, ambassadorial gifts, and conquest, what more might documentary and visual sources have to tell us when combined with technical analysis? Especially for the Islamic objects in Christian settings, scholarship has tended to center around ideas of conquest and appropriation, of one religion's dominance over the other. No doubt that sense must have existed for certain objects in specific circumstances, but perhaps not as frequently as we assume, especially given the extensive system of commerce throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Treasuries like the one from San Isidoro encourage us to shift away from ideas of religious triumphalism, focusing instead on avenues such as the geographic resonance of objects and elite women as prime movers in cultural exchange, which are proving so fruitful in my current research project. Thank you very much.